This canine police dog uncovers a shocking truth no one wanted found. Officer Tessa Greene and her loyal canine partner, Storm, are thrust into a deadly game of deception when they stumble upon a hidden conspiracy tied to a high-profile murder case. As they dig deeper, Storm's unusual behavior reveals a trail that leads to dangerous figures in the criminal underworld. Officer Tessa must rely on Storm's instincts to expose the killer before they both become the next targets. In a race against time, can they uncover the truth without paying the ultimate price? Officer Tessa Greene stood outside the small house, her eyes scanning the quiet area. It had been years since she'd seen Storm, her former canine partner. He had retired after years of dedicated service, and she had taken up her role as a handler with a new dog, but Storm had never really left her thoughts. His sharp senses and intelligence had saved lives countless times. Now, as she approached the yard where Storm was resting, Tessa's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't the same dog she remembered. Storm lay in the shade, his ears twitching at the slightest sound. His eyes, usually alert and focused, now had a distant, unfocused look. He refused to come when Tessa called, staying in the same spot and growling softly. She could hear it, low and constant, like he was warning someone or something. She couldn't see. "Storm, what's wrong?" Tessa said, her voice gentle but filled with concern. The growling stopped for a moment, but the dog didn't respond. He stared at the shadows beneath the trees, his body rigid. Tessa crouched beside him, her hand resting on his thick fur. She had seen him like this before, during cases that had shaken him to his core, but never at home, where he was supposed to be safe. "Come on, buddy. Let's go inside." He stood up slowly, his tail low, still growling at nothing. Tessa's heart sank. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't know what. Whatever it wasn't normal. Minutes later, Tessa was sitting in her patrol car, Storm beside her, as she drove toward the local precinct. The phone call she had received earlier had been about a simple break-in at a nearby convenience store. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but the timing seemed off. She felt an odd sense of unease as she glanced over at Storm, who was now sitting silently in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. As they arrived at the scene, Tessa's instincts kicked in. The store's front door had been forced open, but there were no signs of struggle inside. She entered the store carefully, Storm beside her, his nose twitching. He seemed on edge, and Tessa could feel the tension building between them. "Search," Tessa commanded, her voice steady. Storm immediately began sniffing the ground, moving with purpose. He worked the perimeter, checking every corner, the shelves, and the door where the thief had likely entered. But then, as Storm passed the far corner of the store, he stopped dead in his tracks. Tessa took a step forward. "What is it, Storm?" Storm barked once, loud and sharp, and then began growling again. But this time, it was different. He was focused on a small pile of forgotten cardboard boxes in the back corner. Tessa approached slowly, her hand on her gun. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her eyes scanning the area. Storm wouldn't stop growling, his teeth showing as he backed away from the boxes. Tessa moved forward cautiously, pulling the boxes apart one by one. Her heart raced as she found an odd scent in the air, something familiar but hard to place. It wasn't the usual smell of chemicals or food products that might come from a break-in. This was something deeper, darker. Before she could fully process the situation, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out, quickly reading the text message that had just arrived. "Call your vet. Now." The message was from her partner, Officer Olivia Stone. It took Tessa a moment to understand why she felt an immediate need to listen. Something wasn't right, and she trusted Olivia's instincts as much as her own. Without a second thought, Tessa nodded at Storm and called the vet's office on her way out. By the time Tessa and Storm arrived at the clinic, the vet was already waiting for them. Dr. Jameson was a trusted friend, someone who had cared for Storm since he was a pup. He was serious, focused, and always straightforward. "Is everything all right, Tessa?" Dr. Jameson asked as he led them into the examination room. He could tell something was off just by looking at Storm's behavior. "I'm not sure. He's acting strange, growling at nothing, pacing around, not eating. He's been like this for days, and I'm worried." Dr. Jameson examined Storm, checking his eyes, ears, and paws. He even ran a few tests. After several minutes of silence, he looked up at Tessa. "Physically, he's fine. There's no injury, no illness. But his behavior, this is something I've seen before. It's as if he's sensing something from his past, something traumatic." Tessa's mind raced. Past trauma? Dogs like Storm, they don't forget. They carry the weight of what they've experienced. And sometimes, those memories surface in strange ways. Tessa thought back to the case that had changed everything for her and Storm. Years ago, Storm had helped crack a difficult case involving a dangerous criminal who was known for his ability to escape the law. Storm had led them to the final breakthrough, helping to convict the man and put an end to his reign of terror. But it hadn't been easy on either of them. Tessa had always wondered if Storm had been more affected by that case than he had let on. "I'll dig into it further," Tessa said, her voice steady, but her thoughts tumbling. "Thanks, Doc." As she left the clinic, she couldn't shake the feeling that Storm was trying to tell her something. Something she couldn't quite understand yet. Tessa walked through the quiet halls of the police station, her mind clouded with thoughts of the old case. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about it wasn't as it seemed. Storm's behavior had unsettled her, and the more she thought about it, the more she couldn't ignore the doubts that had crept into her mind years ago. The murder of the Cole family had shaken the city. Adrian Cole, a well-known businessman, had been convicted of killing his wife, daughter, and son in a brutal attack that left the entire area on edge. The evidence had pointed directly to him, circumstantial but damning. Storm had played a crucial role in the investigation, his tracking skills leading them straight to Adrian Cole's hiding place, where the bloodstains confirmed his guilt. The case had seemed clear-cut, the conviction swift, and Tessa had felt a sense of justice when Cole was sentenced to life in prison. Yet, over the years, that sense of justice had faded. Tessa couldn't explain it, but she had always felt a lingering doubt that there was more to the case than what met the eye. She sat down at her desk and began pulling the case files from the drawer. The worn pages were yellowed with time, but the names and details still felt sharp in her mind. Tessa flipped through them, skimming over the statements, the forensic reports, and the photographs from the crime scene. She could still picture the house, the bloodstains on the walls, the shattered glass, the terror that had lingered in the air long after the police had arrived. But one thing stood out in Tessa's memory: the moment Storm had found the bloodstains leading to the hiding spot. He had tracked the scent without hesitation, his nose to the ground, his determination unwavering. The way he had looked up at her when they found Adrian Cole, his eyes steady, as if he knew he had done his part. It had felt like a triumph. But now, looking back, something about it didn't add up. As Tessa combed through the case files, she felt a growing sense of unease. Storm had never been wrong before. His nose had led them to so many criminals, so many missing people. But now, as she thought about it, she couldn't ignore the possibility that they had missed something. Had they gotten it wrong? Had Storm found the scent of someone else? Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Olivia, her old partner who had worked the case with her. "Don't go digging into that case again. Let it go, Tessa. It's over." Tessa's fingers hovered over the phone, her heart heavy with hesitation. She knew Olivia was just trying to protect her. The cold case had been closed for years, and there was no reason to revisit it. But the more she thought about it, the more she felt that something had been missed. She couldn't ignore it. She needed answers. Ignoring Olivia's warning, Tessa made her decision. She stood up from her desk, grabbing her coat and walking out of the office. She needed to go back to the beginning. She needed to visit the crime scene again. The night was crisp and clear as Tessa drove through the quiet streets. Storm sat in the passenger seat, his usual calmness replaced by a sense of restlessness. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward the window as they neared the area. Tessa knew the exact spot. The coal house was just a few blocks away, its dark outline barely visible in the distance. When they arrived, the house was still standing, though it had been abandoned for years. The yard was overgrown, the windows boarded up. It was a stark contrast to the images Tessa remembered from the investigation: lights flashing, police cars everywhere. It had been a crime scene for days, and now it stood silent and forgotten. Tessa parked the car and stepped out, Storm following closely behind. As they approached the house, Storm became more erratic. He sniffed the air, growling softly, his ears twitching with every sound. Tessa's breath caught in her throat as she watched him. He wasn't just reacting to the familiar sense of the area. It was something more. It was as if he was trying to warn her about something that had been buried here all these years. She moved closer to the house, pushing through the tall grass. Storm's growls grew louder, more urgent. Tessa knelt down beside him, her hand resting on his fur as she tried to calm him. "Easy, boy. It's just the old place. We're just looking around." But Storm wouldn't calm down. He kept his gaze fixed on the house, his body tense. There was something there, something he sensed that she couldn't understand. Tessa's mind raced as she glanced back at the house. She had never seen Storm like this before. It wasn't just the scent. There was something else, something connected to the case, to Adrian Cole, to the bloodstains that Storm had tracked all those years ago. What had they missed? What was Storm trying to tell her? She glanced at the front door of the house. The scene played in her mind again, the moment they had entered, the moment Storm had led them to Cole's hiding spot. But now, standing in front of the house, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like a beginning, one she wasn't ready to face, but couldn't ignore. "Let's go inside, Storm," Tessa whispered. As she stepped toward the door, Storm's growls turned into a low, persistent bark. Something was waiting for them inside, something neither of them had fully understood yet. The house looked even more abandoned now, the faded yellow tape that had once surrounded it barely hanging on. Tessa stood outside, her gaze sweeping across the property. She could feel Storm's tension, his body rigid beside her. He refused to move toward the front door. "What is it, Storm?" she asked, crouching beside him. His nose twitched, and he growled again, but this time the sound was deeper, more urgent. She followed his gaze toward the far side of the house, where the trees grew thick and tangled. Storm began pulling at his leash, his eyes locked on the area. Tessa felt a strange sense of foreboding as she stood up and started walking in the direction Storm was fixated on. She wasn't sure what he was reacting to, but she trusted him. They reached the edge of the property, where the trees opened up into a small clearing. Suddenly, Storm stopped, his growls growing louder as he began sniffing the ground. Tessa knelt beside him and examined the area. There, hidden beneath some fallen leaves, she found something that made her heart race, a set of faint, old footprints leading toward the woods. These were no ordinary tracks. They didn't match any of the police reports, and they certainly weren't Adrian Cole's. Tessa's thoughts raced. She quickly pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the prints. She needed to confirm if this was significant. As she stood, she noticed something else. There were faint signs of disturbed ground nearby, as if something or someone had been dragged across it. Storm's growl had turned into a low whine, his eyes locked on a spot near a small, run-down shed that sat on the edge of the property. Tessa moved cautiously toward the shed, trying to make sense of the growing puzzle. Inside, the air was musty, the walls covered in old, rusted tools and broken furniture. But it wasn't the decay that caught Tessa's attention. It was a small metal box tucked away in the corner. She approached it slowly, her mind racing. She opened it carefully, revealing a hard drive and a handful of old photographs, images from the night of the murder. But one stood out. A shadowy figure fleeing the scene, their face obscured. Tessa's heart skipped a beat. The figure was something no one had seen before. Her mind whirled. She had to take this footage to an expert, someone who could recover the deleted files and identify the mysterious figure. As Tessa left the shed, her phone rang. It was Olivia. "I heard you're back at the cold case," Olivia said, her voice tight. "Tessa, you need to drop it. The case is closed, and there's nothing more to find. Stop digging into the past." Tessa's grip tightened around her phone. "I can't, Olivia. I think Adrian Cole is innocent. Someone else was there that night, and I'm going to find out who." "Don't push it," Olivia warned. "You're treading on dangerous ground." Tessa ended the call and turned to Storm, who was once again fixated on the woods behind them. She had no idea where this path would lead, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Later that night, Tessa followed the trail of footprints that Storm had discovered. It led her to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Her flashlight flickered as she crept inside, careful not to make a sound. The smell of dust and old metal filled the air. But as she explored further, the scene that greeted her made her blood run cold. Bloodstains marked the floor. Remnants of a weapon were scattered across a nearby table, and there, tucked away in the corner, was a pile of documents, files that linked the Cole case to a larger criminal organization, one that had never been tied to the investigation. Tessa's heart raced. She had been right to dig deeper. But as she moved to examine the documents further, a loud noise echoed through the warehouse. Someone was here. Before she could react, a figure lunged at her from the shadows, knocking her to the ground. Storm barked and leapt into action, but the attacker was fast, disappearing into the darkness before Tessa could get a good look. All that remained was a cryptic note left behind with a chilling message: "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Tessa knew now that someone wanted to keep the truth buried and they would stop at nothing to make sure she didn't uncover it. Tessa's eyes scanned the note again. "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." The words burned in her mind, sharper than any threat she'd faced in her career. The quiet hum of the warehouse echoed in her ears, but her focus was on the message, the strange twist in the case, and the realization that she had uncovered something much darker than she'd ever expected. Storm's ears were perked, his body stiff with tension as he stood by her side. The usual loyalty and quiet strength she'd always seen in him were now laced with a new kind of urgency. Something was wrong, and Storm knew it. He was trying to tell her, but the pieces of the puzzle were so far apart, and with each step, the truth seemed to slip further away. Tessa had hoped for answers, for closure, but it was clear now that the truth was hidden beneath layers of deceit. She thought about Adrian Cole, locked away for a crime he might not have committed. And the deeper she dug, the clearer it became that something more sinister was at play. She left the warehouse quickly, not wanting to risk another encounter with whoever had left the note. As she drove back to the precinct, she couldn't help but think about the files she'd found. The documents linking the Cole case to a larger criminal organization made her stomach turn. This wasn't just about one murder, it was about years of corruption and cover-ups that reached into the very core of law enforcement. Tessa's mind was clouded with doubts and questions. The case had never seemed straightforward, but now it felt like a game with no rules, one where the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. It wasn't just the past she had to confront. It was the present, a web of lies that stretched far beyond the Cole family murder. When she arrived at the station, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. As she entered her office, she was met with the stern face of her superior officer, Captain Markson. His cold eyes narrowed as he walked toward her. "Tessa," he began, his voice low, controlled. "I've been hearing some things. You've been digging into the Cole case, and I'm telling you now, back off." You've crossed a line." Tessa straightened, her fists clenched at her sides. "I can't do that. Too many questions remain unanswered. Someone's been covering something up. I need to know the truth." "You don't know what you're up against," Markson said, his voice hardening. "This isn't a game, Tessa. Drop it, or I'll have no choice but to remove you from the case. You've been warned." Tessa stood her ground. "I'm not stopping." "Not now." Markson's face darkened. "You've been warned." Before Tessa could respond, she heard a soft growl from Storm, who was standing next to her, his body tense. Markson glanced at the dog, his eyes narrowing. Tessa could tell that Storm wasn't the only one sensing the danger. As she left the office, the weight of Markson's warning hung heavy in the air. She knew she couldn't stop now, but there was no denying that someone was watching her every move. This case had grown far too dangerous, and Tessa knew that she needed help, old allies who understood the risks involved. Tessa didn't hesitate. That night, she reached out to an old friend from her time on the force, Detective Jake Donovan. He was one of the few people she trusted, someone who had always been willing to go the extra mile for justice. "Jake, I need your help," Tessa said when he answered the phone. "I've uncovered something big. Someone's blocking my investigation. I need to know who." "I'll dig around, but you're treading dangerous ground, Tessa." "You've been warned," Jake replied. "You sure you want to keep going?" Tessa's voice was firm. "I don't have a choice. I have to see this through." The next few days were a blur as Jake fed her information about the high-ranking officers involved in the cover-up. It became clear that the true murderer wasn't just anyone, it was someone from within the department, someone who had been hiding in plain sight for years. The more Tessa uncovered, the more she realized that Adrian Cole had been framed. The real killer had orchestrated the entire murder, planting evidence and using Storm's incredible tracking ability to misdirect the investigation. It was a perfect setup, with one huge flaw: the real killer had never been caught, and the truth was buried beneath a mountain of lies. As Tessa pieced the puzzle together, she realized the killer was closer than she had imagined. The person she was after was someone she had once trusted, someone who had been working with the criminal organization that had been running the streets for years. She and Storm tracked the scent of the real murderer to an isolated cabin on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as they approached the cabin, Storm's growls growing louder as they got closer. The scent in the air was familiar, but this time, it wasn't just about Storm's tracking skills. This was a moment of reckoning. Tessa's hand was steady as she reached for her gun, her heart pounding with the knowledge of what was about to happen. The killer knew they were coming. The confrontation would be inevitable. As they entered the cabin, the real murderer appeared from the shadows, a former police officer, someone Tessa had once trusted completely. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but there was no mistaking the fear in his eyes. "You don't have to do this, Tessa," the murderer said, his voice calm but strained. "You've uncovered too much. You won't win." "You should have stopped when you had the chance," Tessa said, her voice steady as she aimed her gun. Storm's growls intensified, his body poised for action. In a split second, the murderer lunged for the door, but Storm was faster. The dog's instincts kicked in, and with a swift movement, he brought the murderer down, holding him in place until Tessa could arrest him. "You're done," Tessa said as she cuffed him, her hands shaking from the adrenaline. "This ends now." With the killer apprehended, Tessa and Storm stood in the quiet of the cabin, the truth finally uncovered. Adrian Cole would be released from prison, but Tessa knew that the cost of this victory was greater than she had imagined. As the case closed, Tessa found herself alone with her thoughts. She and Storm had both been changed by this experience. The toll it had taken on them, on their trust, their loyalty, their sense of justice, was something that would stay with them forever. And as she drove away from the cabin, she couldn't shake the lingering question: what had the pursuit of justice really cost her? The past was never truly gone. It lived within them both, a shadow that they could never fully escape.